Today, I want to talk about burnout because I think it's a subject that isn't discussed enough and is even almost trivialized these days, while it can have very serious consequences, not only in terms of work, but also in terms of personal life. So, I want to make an awareness audio, knowing that this is something that I experienced myself and that it took me quite a while to get over it. And I'm sure that if I had known the signs to look out for at the time, I could have avoided ending up in such a state. It seems important to me to know what to watch out for to protect yourself and others. So, the quickest definition I found is erosion of values, dignity, spirit, and will. It is a progressive and continuous suffering. We'll go into details, obviously. So, in fact, yes, it is progressive and continuous in principle where burnout does not appear overnight. This is something that will get worse over time, and therefore, the sooner we see the signs, the sooner we can get out of it. In terms of signs and symptoms, there is first of all physical exhaustion. So, being completely drained of resources and rest times are no longer enough. That is to say that even if you sleep well, that you have your weekends, that you have the rest time necessary in theory to be able to work, it is no longer enough. You still feel like you're always exhausted. And that's if you're lucky enough to be able to sleep, because obviously it can also cause sleep problems. It can also cause muscle tension because you are so tense at work that your muscle will have difficulty relaxing and that will create pain. You also have less vitality because you are exhausted. You cannot gain or lose weight quite quickly. This is a symptom that goes with stress. It depends on the person. There are some, when they are stressed, who will not eat anything, and others who, on the contrary, will eat much more to compensate for their discomfort. Knowing that you may also have the impression of not eating more, of having a normal and healthy diet, but of still gaining or losing weight because your digestive system will be affected by stress. Another physical symptom, which is often linked to eating or sleeping problems, is headaches, nausea, or even dizziness. Then there is emotional exhaustion. So, the feeling of losing control of your emotions, having undefined fears, anxiety, having a sad mood, a lack of enthusiasm, being defeatist. This is something I saw at the beginning when I started to feel a pit in my stomach on the way to work, but I still couldn't figure out exactly what was causing it. I didn't know if it was just tiredness or the fact that there had been changes at work and I couldn't get used to it yet. So I didn't necessarily pay enough attention to these signs, even though it's one of the first symptoms. You have to be able to say to yourself, there is something wrong. I can't figure out what. Maybe I should take a step back and ask myself some questions. There is also cognitive exhaustion, which is something quite disturbing when you experience it. We don't always realize it, or we might even laugh about it at first. I know that in my case, we laughed about it a bit with my colleagues until I started to panic. You have decreased concentration, difficulty carrying out several tasks at once. And I know that toward the end, before I went on sick leave for burnout, when a colleague came to interrupt me in my task, afterwards, I no longer knew what I was actually doing. So it was a bit of a game where they watched what I was doing, they interrupted me, and before leaving, they told me what I was doing before they arrived. And given that I don't necessarily have the best memory in the world, for me it was just due to fatigue. Whereas, no, it was more serious than that. We also have difficulty in nuancing, in making decisions. We'll make more minor errors, mistakes, oversights. And what struck me the most was the loss of bearings and sense of directions. For almost a year and a half, I took the exact same way to work, and I happened to get lost on the way home. And it's true that it's something that makes you panic a little because it's your city, the path you know, and suddenly to lose this reference point and to realize that you don't even know how to get home anymore, it's really scary. And I think that was the symptom that most made me aware that there was a problem. Then there are the behavioral and interpersonal manifestations. We can become cynical, negative, harsh, detached from work. That is to say that unconsciously we become less involved and we can also dehumanize others, have less empathy, and become like a robot. It happened. I am basically a very empathetic person who will therefore very easily sense when someone next to me is not doing well or is having problems. And there it's as if I had barriers that had been created, that I no longer felt what others felt, and that I myself no longer felt anything. And when it's not in our nature not to care about others at all, we feel it. We tell ourselves that there is a problem because we are aware that we should feel something. For example, if you have a colleague or even a friend who is going through a very difficult phase, you are aware that you are supposed to feel something, whether it is sadness, compassion, or something else, but there you don't feel anything at all, as if you didn't care, while you do. It gives the impression of becoming a bad person, a bad friend, which consequently adds a feeling of guilt. We will also withdraw into ourselves, isolate ourselves socially, because being around others people makes us feel bad, stressed, even more tired. We don't have the energy to give for outings, for socializing. We also have the impression of no longer understanding others. It's very complicated, especially since it often goes hand in hand with the reduction in frustration tolerance. So the slightest little thing will irritate us. We no longer have patience, we no longer have empathy, we can no longer take a step back. As a result, we are much more irritable and we also lose goodwill. Then there are the motivational manifestations. Obviously, there is a drop in motivation and morale because we are exhausted, no matter how motivated we are, we will not be able to do as much as before. And in fact, the maximum that we will be able to give will no longer be the same. And it will depress us because we will have the impression of doing our job less well, of doing less. We will blame ourselves. And morale will also play a role in that because we feel like crap. We say to ourselves, I know I can do better than that, but I can't do it. So we have a reduction in personal accomplishment and we experience less satisfaction at work because inevitably we are less proud of ourselves. So when we are not proud of what we do at work, we question ourselves all the time. We end up devaluing ourselves by having the impression of no longer being worthy of our position and of not be affecting anymore. And as a result, we obviously no longer want to go there, since afterwards we have the fear, and sometimes rightly so, of thinking that our boss will come upon us and reprimand us. Be careful, not all bosses are like this. There are some who will understand that there is a problem and who will try to talk about it with you and find solutions. But there are also some who will only see the drop in results and who will blame you for it without trying to understand what is happening. You will also perhaps experience the crumbling of the values associated with work, or for example, it could be the group spirit of mutual aid, where you have the impression that the fact of always being in a group is the weight, given that you are in a phase where you want to isolate yourself. It may seem that the company prioritizes turnover rather than the employees themselves. And that goes with feeling like we don't get enough recognition, feeling like the boss doesn't care about us. And also, obviously, you will start to doubt about yourself, about your own skills, about your team, the work itself. You may wonder if this job really suits you, if you are as well integrated into the team as you thought, because you don't feel supported. We may have the impression of complaining for nothing, of annoying others. Knowing that the burnout can very quickly worsen into depression and extend to all aspects of life and not just at work. That is to say that you are so exhausted at work, you give so much energy to continue to carry out your task as well as possible, that for your personal life, you no longer have as much energy. And so you may have the impression of being overwhelmed, of no longer having time to do anything, whether it is cleaning, eating, shopping, seeing your friends, because that's a fact. You don't have that energy anymore. Except it makes you feel guilty because you feel like a wreck. Because when you get home, all you want to do is go to bed and nothing else. It is said that burnout will affect more people who attach a lot of importance to their profession and to the meaning given to their work, to values. Because someone who basically doesn't get more involved in their work can be exhausted, obviously, but there will be less of this feeling of guilt than for someone who really wants to do their job well. In case of doubt, I know that my psychologist did it to me at the very first appointment, and that this is precisely what supported the diagnosis of burnout. There is the CBI detection questionnaire, Copenhagen Burnout Inventory. I will put the link in the description. The questionnaire itself is not a leap of faith, obviously, but I think that if you don't yet have the courage to take the step to go to a psychologist or a doctor, taking this test can confirm that you are not well and that you really need help, that it's not just a temporary bout of fatigue. Obviously, it's like everything, there are risk factors: the intensity and complexity of the work, the quantity of work, and excessive hours. Obviously, if you feel like too much is being asked of you and you can't keep up, you will never feel up to it. And even if you manage to keep up, you will burn out because too much is asked of you. There are also unrealistic or poorly defined deadlines and goals. This is something that brings a lot of frustration because you will inevitably fail. What you do will never be good enough, no matter how hard you try. There is also verbal violence, which can come depending on the work, from customers, patients, colleagues, or hierarchy. If you have difficult contact with the public or the team, if there is a lack of trust or an inability to be heard, that also makes things worse. Because if you feel that you are not doing well and you have the courage to talk about it to someone at your workplace, and the person in front of you does not listen to you, does not care at all, you're going to feel guilty because you're going to feel like you're complaining for nothing, as if you wanted to draw attention to yourself and make yourself complain when no, you are expressing real discomfort. If the person in front of you doesn't react, they will lose your trust. And working with someone you no longer trust is very complicated because you will question everything they say. What is also tiring is displaying emotions that contradict your feelings. Having done sales, it especially makes me think of the professional smile, where no matter what state of mind you are in, whether you are sad, angry, or tired, when you are in front of a customer, you must be polite, have a smile, act as if everything is fine. And that is very complicated to manage because it requires a lot of energy. But you have to do it because it's part of your job, and until the end, you want to do your job correctly. So, what should you do when you realize that you are burning out and need help? Obviously, I don't know all the administrative procedures, but generally, for it to be made official, you need to see a psychologist who will confirm it and take you to the occupational medicine. This will very often end in sick leave with psychological monitoring or even antidepressants. We will advise you to get plenty of rest, relaxation, and sport. That's the easy part. Knowing that often when we take time off for burnout, there is still this feeling of guilt of saying to yourself, I'm abandoning my colleagues. They are going to have to do my part of work, and in the end, they will end up like me. So it's completely legitimate to think that, except that you must not forget that you are not responsible for the organization of your team. You are not responsible for what the hierarchy will decide to do once you stop. So, unfortunately, even if your colleagues are overwhelmed after, tell yourself that this may finally make your superiors react, and that if not, it is not your fault. What matters the most is your own well being, because if it turns into depressions, or worse, it can end in suicidal thoughts, it is better to stop first. Knowing that the things to do to recover from burnout are not just about resting, getting away from work, and waiting for things to get better. It's much deeper than that because you have to do the work of rebuilding your identity, therefore, re establishing the balance between professional and personal life. Make sure that work no longer encroaches on your everyday life, that when you leave work, the worries you may have there stay there, and that you don't bring them home. You also need to take a step back and analyze the elements that contributed to burnout, to learn how to deal with them, avoid them, and protect yourself from them. If, for example, you realize that you have been given too much work, perhaps you can manage to learn to say no, to explain that you already have too many tasks to do, and that perhaps you should delegate more. It's very hard to get out of this stage where we are totally submissive because we no longer have the strength to fight because of fatigue, to tell ourselves that we are going to have to say no, especially if it doesn't go with the hierarchy. It can be extremely complicated. You have to learn to listen to yourself, to listen to the warning signals, because generally, when you are in burnout, the body and the mind give warning signals way before you reach the breaking point. But you don't listen to them because we tell ourselves that it's just a phase, that it will pass. Personally, I know that I was aware about 4 or 5 months before that things were starting to deteriorate, But I pulled on the rope. I didn't want to leave for many reasons, because I felt guilty towards my colleagues, because I loved my work despite everything, and in the end, I waited so long that when I finally went to see a psychologist, I was already in a severe stage of burnout, which is not the best thing to do, since obviously it takes a lot longer to recover. Whereas if you say stop from the start, recovery will be faster and the wounds will be less deep. When you recover from burnout, you have to take a step back. You have to think, regain the desire to work. So I think it could be a good time to ask yourself whether you should stay in the same company, but then you will have a dialogue with the hierarchy so that it doesn't happen again, or if you should change position or even change company. I know that, for example, in terms of preparing to return to work, we must lose all the fears and uncertainties that were created by the burnout. We are afraid it will start again. You have to be able to reassure yourself and make a gradual return to work to avoid relapses. This is a little advice that I will give, but there are indicators within a company which you can see if you are in an integration internship or if you prefer to start with a fixed term contract, which can be reassuring also because you have a deadline in case of problems. There are even indicators that you can observe from the outside as a simple customer, for example. If you pay a little attention to employees, you can see signs about the atmosphere within the company and the team. Among the most obvious indicators are absenteeism, personal movements, departures, and unfilled positions. You can even ask these questions if you're having a job interview, for example. I know that in the company where I worked, departures were very frequent, and that was not normal. When you have almost three quarters of a team living at the same time regularly, there is a problem with the company. The relationships within the team are also something you can see, as is ensuring the atmosphere. If you enter a store and you see that the employees are all sullen, that they are not talking to each other, that they do not seem to be getting along, it can be felt very quickly. You can sometimes even see members of the hierarchy show up in the middle of a store and talk very badly to an employee. This is something you can witness before even applying. So, preparing to return to work is the most important thing because you have to protect yourself. So, we must not trivialize burnout. You have to take it seriously and you have to accept the fact that it takes a long time to recover from it. It could take several months, and in the end, it's an experience that will traumatize you and prevent you from easily finding a job because you are so afraid of what could happen that you have to overcome it. This is why psychological follow up is important to regain self confidence and to be able to tell yourself that now that you know the sign, if you see them, you will know what to do. And obviously, you have to do the same thing with your colleagues. If you notice that they seem to be thinking, but they don't realize it, you need to tell them. The world of work is not the simplest, far from it, because there are a lot of companies which only rely on turnover and for whom the team matters little because it is replaceable. What matters is that you feel good, even if it's not necessarily a job you would have turned to at first. For example, being someone who is very introverted and who doesn't necessarily like contact with strangers, I would never have thought of doing sales. And in the end, when I found myself there, I realized that I was capable of doing it and that I loved it. I think we should not close ourselves to all options. In the end, you have nothing to lose by trying. At worst, you will just have confirmation that this or that job does not suit you. So, really, learn to protect yourself, see the signs, and not blame yourself. You are just a human being doing your best, and you have your limits. And that's completely normal. It doesn't make you a bad person or a bad employee to say no or stop from time to time. We just need to remind people that everyone is different and has their tolerance threshold on that they need to be taken into account.